Well, welcome everybody. Hey, there's only a few of us here, and we are missing one candidate. But anyway, let's come forward. It's an opportunity to. We don't have to be ultra formal, but it is an opportunity to be here together, and there are people joining us online. So we could do that, couldn't we? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I know quite a few here of the small number that are. But my name's David Morse. I'm the pastor here. So we agreed to host this on behalf of an organisation called Freedom for Faith. And the idea was just that local churches were able to come together and ask questions of candidates. It's actually also on their website. So big thank you to Andrew Wilkie, who's represented Clark for how many years, Andrew?
Just going on 15 years.
Wow, that's a pretty good effort, isn't it? I reckon he needs a hand for that. Because public life isn't easy, and it has its challenges, so thank you for that. And Janet, representing the Australian Greens, and I was just talking to Janet beforehand, and a big commitment too. She's had to give up her role as a public servant to be able to run and to stand for what she believes in. So thank you so much for joining us. So basically, yeah. If you need the amenities, they're through that roller door back there and around to the right. And other than that, we can get rolling into things. So the idea is there's some set questions that come through Freedom of Faith, and there'll be a video explaining each one of those. But before we do that, we can allow the candidates here just to introduce themselves and just... We've got 3 minutes just to talk about who they are and what they believe in, and then we'll get into the questions. And then we'll be able to quite easily, respectfully manage questions from the floor, and there will be some that may come through online too. So if we can start with you, Andrew.
Is that on?
Yep, you're away.
Is that on? Okay. Well, first of all, a big thank you for the invitation to come along tonight, and also for organising this. I understand it's streaming out, or some people might watch it later. From a recording, so hopefully the audience will be okay. Look, can I start by saying that at the core of Christian ideology, and I'll read this sentence so I get it just right, is the call to do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And I think that principle also underpins my whole approach to my work. I have a strong sense of social justice, and when you look at the work I have done for about 15 years, I hope that is obvious that I am always pursuing social justice in all sorts of ways. It helps to explain my strong interest in the public education system, the public health system, the public transport system, basically all of those systems which provide essential services to the most disadvantaged members of our community. It also helps to explain my strong support for Centrelink recipients and my calls for years that government income support through Centrelink be lifted above the poverty line so that people, whether they be unemployed or disabled or aged or in a carer role or whatever, can all live the sort of decent, dignified life that our country can afford. It helps to explain my push for the whole 15 years for gambling reform and to do everything we can to prevent gambling addiction and everything we humanly can to help and support those who have gambling addiction. It helps to explain my interest in climate change, which might seem like an odd thing to be talking about when we're talking about social justice, but I actually see climate change as the most egregious example of intergenerational social injustice that we could imagine. That we are leaving the planet in the state we are leaving it for our children. explains my passion for helping asylum seekers. And I hope people have noticed, or it doesn't matter if they've noticed or not, the main thing is I have been able to hopefully stand up for asylum seekers. It just seems so obvious to me. And when I put it in these terms to people who are anti-asylum seekers, they almost always agree with me, David. When I say, do you think if someone is fleeing for their life, that you should straight away give them protection, hear what they've got to say, and if their claims about fleeing for their life are accurate, that you should give them refuge? I think when we put it in those terms, most people actually tend to agree with me, even if the conversation starts out in different ways. Of course, for every one of my the things I champion, there's no shortage of critics, and probably the most common criticism of me is, "Oh, well, you're an independent. You don't have to pay for it. You don't have to find the money for a better hospital or for a better school or a better transport system or lifting unemployment benefits above the poverty line." And I say back to them, and I'm sorry, Janet, you probably heard this a number of times on the campaign trail. But, you know, we're a country of only about 28 million people, and we're the 13th biggest economy in the world. By some measures, we have the highest per capita median income of any people in any country anywhere in the world. So I say to my critics, we can afford to be a fairer and more compassionate country. It's all about priorities and what the priorities of any one government are. And I think that with a better set of priorities, we can be a fairer and more compassionate place. So that's where I come from. That's some insights into why I do what I do and why I hope I'm being re-elected. Although if I'm not, I know there's some very good, compassionate people waiting in the wings.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was a great little sort of manifesto of where you come from, and you certainly touched on some important issues and things that are actually important to people of faith and important to the church. So thanks for sharing that. So Janet, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're running and what you're going to stand for.
Lovely. Well, I would like to, again, also thank you, David, for organising this tonight. I always say if Australians spent 1/10 of their time that they do watching and discussing their football, if they spent that time discussing politics, we would have one of the most informed societies on the planet. Anyway, so thank you for organising that. I would like to start off just firstly by acknowledging that we are on Aboriginal land here. I'm rather ashamed to say that it was only a couple years ago that I learnt that the Muwinina people, who were the occupants of this beautiful Nipaluna Hobart, actually didn't survive colonisation. The whole people are now extinct, so we can't actually acknowledge elders present. And you know, when we talk about building a compassionate society and what do we want our vision for the future to be, I think reconciliation with our past and our history begins with telling the truth and acknowledging what happened, and then we can start to move on and actually develop a unified front. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And secondly, I also wanted to acknowledge just the passing of the Pope this week, and just what an emotional week that is for so many Christians and non-Christians alike, I think. When such a significant figure passes on, there's a lot of emotion there. And to introduce myself, so I guess why am I running? I think there's probably two main sources of inspiration for me. The first is my training and my work. I work in environmental management / sustainability for government departments. So for 10 years I was with the Bureau of Meteorology and got to travel to some amazing places around the country and external territories, including I was head of a tiny little island in the Coral Sea for 6 months, and also got to spend a summer down in Antarctica, and it's just mind-boggling, these wonderful places on this earth that I got to experience through that work. And now I work, well, when I haven't quit my job, I work for the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. And so for an environmental nerd like me, it's like living in the playground, because just being surrounded by all these policy boffins and experts that I adore. So with that work experience, for me, standing up and actually saying how important it is to address our climate crisis and I guess our environmental / extinction crisis, they really drive me to stand up. I tell the joke, and it's not really a joke, but there's only so many times you can have a climate scientist cry on your shoulder saying we're doomed before you actually think we've got to take some action. The other main influence for me was my late mother, who was a social worker, and she always used to say to me, it is the responsibility of anyone in power or with power to stand up for those that have no voice. And through my life, we've had some bad times in my family. Talking earlier on to Leanne about, receiving food baskets and stuff like that. I remember, watching my mother cry when she had no idea how we were going to actually pay the mortgage or buy food or pay bills. I've been homeless from domestic violence during my adult life, and it wrecks me to see, even this morning when I was at the Hobart Rivulet, seeing people living in tents. I'm like, this is not acceptable in this life. So now that I'm in an awesome situation, I've got a stable job, stable partner, I have a house over my head, I feel that I can't sit on the sidelines and not say anything, so I've got to speak up. I guess there's one other reason too. People say, I've been an Andrew Wilkie fangirl for years. The public servant that stood up to what was right and blow the lid on corruption. That's like, woo! So it's also an extra thrill to be able to get up here with one of your, long-term heroes. I say that genuinely. But also too, people say, well, why do you stand when there's a good guy in charge? And it's so that I can also get up here on stage and bring another perspective or reinforce these important values that I think are important. And we're in a democracy. Let's do it and let's take advantage. So I encourage everyone to participate in that regard.
Thanks, Janet. And thanks for your vulnerability. And wasn't it actually nice to hear politicians to be able to cheer one another on from different sides of the aisle, and we'd love to see more of that. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And so we might move into some questions now that are important to people of faith, and particularly to Christians. And obviously, religious freedoms, it's been, well publicised, and it's had an interesting journey in many ways. But obviously, that's something that's incredibly important to people of faith. It's incredibly important to us as a church to be able to do that. So there's a video, I won't talk any more about that, which sort of just tells us a little bit about that. But the question is, how will you protect the individual rights of religious freedom, expression and conscience, and the right of parents to raise and educate their children in accordance with their faith? So, that's pretty key to, where many people of faith are, or in fact, I'd say most people, yeah.
Religious freedom isn't just about what we believe in the privacy of our own homes. It's about the right to express those beliefs, to speak openly, to practice freely, and even to hold and express views that are unpopular. It also means not being forced to say or do things that are against our faith. And this isn't just a nice idea, it's a human right protected under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which states that every person has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, including the freedom to worship, practice, and even teach our beliefs, whether in public or in private, by ourselves or as a group. It also says that every parent has the right to teach what they believe to their children and have them educated in their faith. Australia is a signatory to this international covenant, and it is legislated as one of the 7 core international human rights treaties that Australia has adopted. Despite this, we have no national laws that protect religious freedom. Instead, we rely on a patchwork of laws that usually mention religion as an afterthought, and often as an exemption rather than as a positive right. Right now, religious freedom is under great pressure. Beliefs that have been consistently taught for thousands of years are starting to be defined as harmful or bigoted, and laws are being enacted that restrict these teachings in the name of inclusiveness and protecting people from harm. For example, proposals for vilification legislation have been drafted with a new subjective test, where the mere expression of a religious belief could be punished if a person from a protected group might consider it harmful. In Victoria, laws have been made that make certain prayers illegal, and a government commission has a website listing what prayers are acceptable and what ones are not. Those laws could see parents punished for simply encouraging their child to follow religious teachings on gender and sexuality. Companies have followed the example of our governments, and people have lost their jobs or been punished at work for expressing their beliefs, or even simply because of what church they went to. Trying to silence religious beliefs does not create a more inclusive society. Instead, it creates one that excludes people of faith. Australia needs a government that understands the importance of religious freedom and protects the rights for all people to respectfully debate and disagree on these most fundamental issues. Will you protect the individual rights of religious freedom, expression, and conscience, and the right for parents to raise and educate their children in accordance with their faith?
So, Janet.
And this is probably where I make myself unpopular of the evening after a great introduction. Look, the Greens believe that people of faith should be free to practice their religion without fear of harm or prejudice, but they also believe that human rights matter. When I was reflecting how to explore this question, I thought it might be useful if I go into a bit of my own background. So I came from a really religious family. It was pretty similar to this church, I think. Our best family friends were missionaries that often went over to Africa. I was in a Christian child group called Joy Noise and performed in supermarkets and things like that. Our religion and our religious beliefs infiltrated every part of our life and undermined every single, underlaid every single belief and decision that we had as a family. And I've seen the absolute best of religion, and I've also seen bits of the not so great. So, the best, the church and religious groups and our fellow Christian friends were amazing. The support they've given us over the years when we had hard times. I remember one family friend ringing up out of the blue and offering us money saying, "Oh, God just told me you guys really needed something right now." And, it was amazing, the absolute timing of that. But then I've also seen too less than desirable elements. So, for instance, my father wrote a great, I think it was a 200-page treatise for his church on how the wife should be subservient to the man, which doesn't really go down too well with me, and also to things like one of my first childhood memories was being held on the ground while people were praying over me in tongues because they had to get out my sin to cure my baby brother's cancer. And I was all of 4 years old, and I wasn't very eloquent back then, but I remember thinking, I'm 4, what sin have I done? And I didn't, I might have stolen some chocolate cake from the counter or something, but I didn't cause my brother's cancer. So we have to be really careful here, and I think I'm not going to be able to give, I think it was Mike, the answer I think he was looking for, in that we need to be really careful here with this sort of thing. And I think about my dear friend Glenn, who is still recovering now after decades of conversion therapy and being told repeatedly, you are wrong, your fundamental being is wrong. And that's literally, he's only just at the age of 50 started living his life as his true self and accepting himself. And so I have a lot of caution in terms of I think Mike was pretty much saying, are we going to strengthen legislative reforms to protect freedoms? And I really have concerns there and tread carefully, especially too, we've got to think all religions here and what else could be interpreted under such legislation. So, yeah, that's my unpopular answer to that question.
Thank you, Janet. Thanks again for your own journey and your vulnerability. And actually, I'll jump in the sense that I'm really sorry that you experienced that in a church and a space that is supposed to be safe. So, from my perspective and a lot of other people that might be listening, we're sorry you experienced that. And we don't want, by and large, most churches don't want to see that. So we're so sorry that's your experience.
I did meant to say in that, I just want to say the church and all that community also gave me the traits that I think I'm so proud of, that bravery and compassion and respect for others. So please don't interpret that as a church bashing thing, because we're all human and we just try to improve, and we are all fallible.
Yeah, good stuff. So Andrew, what would you do to protect religious freedom?
Yeah, look, I'm pleased that the questions have split the issue of individual religious freedom and community religious freedom, because although they are both the same issue, they're actually quite different, and I think we'll find we'll get quite different answers, certainly from me, in response to those two different questions. In regard to individual religious freedom, the question is, what will you do? Well, I'll tell you what I've done. I have crafted and twice attempted to move in the House of Representatives a Bill of Rights. On both occasions, the private members' bill was not supported by the Labor Party nor the Liberal Party. And I'm disappointed about that, because Australia is actually an outlier in the world when it comes to not having a Bill of Rights. New Zealand has a Bill of Rights. The US, of course, has a Bill of Rights. The UK has a Bill of Rights. And numerous other countries, and they have different names: the Charter of Rights, or a Bill of Rights and Responsibilities. Even in Australia, the ACT, Queensland and Victoria all have Bills of Rights, but again, they've all got slightly different names. So at the federal level, at the national level, we are the outlier, that we don't actually have enshrined in law the fundamental right to religious freedom. And it is a fundamental right, as so well explained in that video. So it's a mystery why we don't have something at the federal level to enshrine in law that right. At the federal level, there are I think it's 5 acts which provide rights. There's the Sex Discrimination Act. Oh, this is going to test me. Who can name them? I think there's an Age Discrimination Act. I'll Google it while Janet's talking. But there's no religious discrimination act, and in fact, nowhere in any of our laws is there a detailed and explicit, does it explicitly and directly address the issue of religious freedom. And my bill that I moved twice did go to this point, that individuals would have a right to religious freedom, to subscribe to whatever religion or faith-based system they choose, and that the state nor anyone else would have a right to interfere in that. Of course, these are individual rights. And I noticed in the video the issue, what was effectively talking about conversion practices was touched on. Conversion practices, of course, would normally be when probably a parent might impose some sort of conversion practice on a child, perhaps because of their sexuality. That's actually one individual interfering in the rights of another individual. And in my opinion, decisions about one's sexuality are an individual's decision, and they are often decisions that can't be made until they're able to do it as an adult or as a mature person and make an informed decision about it. So that was one thing in that video which I was uncomfortable with, to be quite frankly, because that wasn't he wasn't talking about individual rights there. He was talking about the rights of one person to make a decision affecting another person.
Yep. So that's your take on that, and obviously this has been a minefield. You know, in our whole walk as.
Actually, can I just add a footnote there?
Yep.
I just realised I don't think I used it my whole time. Can I just make one quick footnote? One of the arguments against a Bill of Rights at the national level is it will become a lawyer's picnic, that everyone will be going straight to the courts, to dispute things, to assert their rights. The best example of that is not the case would be the UK, where it was introduced, it was controversial, it was introduced, all of a sudden people had their fundamental rights protected in British law, and it wasn't a lawyer's picnic at all.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Well, let's look at the at community religious freedom, and I think you did a good job of sort of talking about the way that you look at it differently, Andrew. So how will you protect the positive right of faith-based organisations, including churches, charities and educational institutions to operate according to their faith? This includes employing staff and engaging volunteers who believe and practice their faith. And my disclaimer is I've worked in leading a movement in the state and as part of our nation too, and that these questions actually take up a lot of time in thinking through things at a peak body level. There's no doubt about that, and I guess the issue, probably just to put a bit more feel around that, is for organisations the feeling of what comes down the pipeline and a barrage of stuff that seems to come our way. Makes you feel somewhat fearful about what's going to come in the future. So watch the video. I've given my little personal view and experience on that. Yeah.
Freedom of religion doesn't just include individual religious belief and practice. It protects our ability to worship and live out our faith together as a group. This means religious communities must have the freedom to gather, worship, teach, and serve. This is part of freedom of association, the right to gather together with people who share the same beliefs as you. Part of this right is the ability to create institutions based on faith. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples, so people can gather and worship together. But faith isn't just about worship. We also need to build schools so we can educate our children in line with our faith, and charities so we can live out our faith by caring for others. Australia has a rich history of being blessed by faith-based institutions. Many of our largest charities, hospitals, shelters, aged care and aid, were founded as expressions of faith and still operate today because of their faith identity. Equally, the very first schools in Australia were founded by the church, and today 1 in 3 parents choose to send their child to a faith-based school, and that number is growing. These institutions serve all Australians, regardless of background, but they fundamentally remain religious organisations, built on faith, guided by faith, and successful because of our faith. But all this has been put under threat by governments and legislation that are trying to force religious organisations to compromise on their beliefs or prevent them from running their institutions according to their convictions. One of the most serious areas of pressure is employment and appointment of volunteers. At both state and federal level, laws have been introduced or proposed that would prevent faith-based organisations from preferencing employees who share and live out that organisation's faith. Our institutions are about our people. To be a faith-based school or charity, we need people who not only say they believe our faith, but who live it out in everything they do. Faith-based charities are not just service providers. They're mission-driven organisations that serve others because of their faith. Schools and colleges don't just teach curriculum, they help to shape and form students' characters in a set of values and beliefs. And Australians are increasingly choosing to send their children to schools who form their students based on faith. And school staff, executives and teachers and support staff are the people who set that culture. Australia is greatly blessed by our faith-based institutions, educational, charities and places of worship. But none of this can happen unless they can choose to employ people who uphold and live out their faith. So, will you protect the right of faith-based organisations, including charities and educational institutions, to operate according to their faith? This includes employing staff and engaging volunteers who believe and practice their faith.
So, Andrew.
Well, I think that video did a really good job of making the case for a Religious Discrimination Act. Those who have the opposite point of view would be quick to say that, quite rightly would be quick to say that in giving any person or group of people added rights, it must not be at the expense of taking rights away from another group of people. There's also in Tasmania the concern, quite understandably again, that we have the best Anti-Discrimination Act currently of any state in Australia. And there is, I think, a quite justified fear that a federal Religious Discrimination Act could have the effect of watering down our protections, which are working really well at the moment. I've had this job for 15 years, and I am not aware of any issues that have blown up in any schools when it's come to what students can attend a faith-based school, nor the hiring practices of the management of those schools. In fact, when I look around my patch, this part of Tasmania, all of the faith-based schools have a really diverse range of students, and are not too fussed about what staff do in their private time. So I'm not sure that, I mean, maybe it's very different on the mainland, and I think it is different on the mainland, but I think as far as Tasmanians go, when we have a good Anti-Discrimination Act currently, and there seems to be a harmony in faith-based schools, at our state level, in some ways I feel like we're trying to find a problem for a solution, as opposed to a solution for a problem. But the fact is, and I readily acknowledge this, the fact is there are a great many people of faith who are concerned about this landscape and are clamouring for a Religious Anti-Discrimination Act. And I get that. I understand why that is the mood. I understand the sense of urgency behind this, and I respect that. And so it's something that has to be dealt with. It's not good enough for anyone to just simply say a Religious Discrimination Act is wrong, we mustn't have one, now let's move on, because that actually won't bring peace to all the people who are concerned about the need for a Religious Discrimination Act. So it needs to be addressed, and I lament the fact that the Morrison government shelved the work it was doing on a Religious Discrimination Act, and then the Albanese government has also refused to progress confronting this. So I feel that the community has been let down by both sides of politics. We can't just ignore it. The challenge is to find the sweet spot that does bring comfort to faith-based educators, that doesn't water down the Tasmanian anti-discrimination protections already, and doesn't have the effect of discriminating against one group in the pursuit of giving protections for another group. Now, I'm over time, but we've only got two candidates up here, so I reckon you'll cut me some slack. The government did actually have the Australian Law Reform Commission look at this and do a report into it, and it got very, very mixed reviews. The LGBTQI+ community said that's good, let's implement it. A lot of faith-based educators said that's bad, it must not proceed. But I think we're all going to have to open our minds a little bit, and I would draw the attention of the critics of this report to a couple of key points. Even with what the Australian Law Reform Commission recommended by amending the Sex Discrimination Act and the Fair Work Act, it did find in the report that amending the Sex Discrimination Act would have minimal effect, because anti-discrimination laws in most states and territories already prohibit discrimination against staff and students of religious educational institutions. And also it goes on to note that even with the changes it suggests to the Fair Work Act, that faith-based schools would still have a right under the Fair Work Act to give preference in good faith to a person of the same religion, where the giving of such a preference is reasonably necessary to build or maintain a community of faith, is proportionate to the aim of building or maintaining a community of faith, including in light of any disadvantage or harm that may be caused to any person or persons not preferred, and would not amount to conduct that is unlawful under the Sex Discrimination Act. That was a long-winded way of saying that reform can be achieved that would still give schools, I mean, I don't think students is the issue here, I think it's staff, that would give schools the right still to give preference in good faith to people of faith for those sorts of reasons.
Yep. And I think actually what you're saying, Andrew, is in one sense true, that it's happening in a practice level, but I think the issue is what happens if a government or a bureaucracy wants to push buttons in a certain direction in the future. So I think that's really where faith-based organisations sit. We understand that there are things there to protect currently, but I think people see that it can also be shifted in such a way, on the bent of whoever happens to be.
Yeah, and I respect that. I absolutely respect what you just had to say, David. Hence, I'm critical of the Albanese government and the Morrison government for not confronting this issue and dealing with it in as effective a way as we can, so the matter is, dealt with, and we all get on with our lives.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. I think what I do appreciate is you're very much across that, probably more than many politicians are, and so thank you. So where do you sit on that, Janet?
I'm going to come out straight away and say I am no way across it nearly a tenth as much as Andrew is, and I'm not going to try. Or even you, David, I'm sure you'd completely kick me across the floor in terms of understanding the subtleties of this. So I guess I'm going to bring it back to values. The first is I really do want to acknowledge just why communities of faith would feel threatened by this idea that the state are going to come in and make rules and undermine your core values. I do not want to underplay that in any sense or fashion. In my really rudimentary reading for this, I was looking at the International Convention of Civil and Political Rights, and yes, it does afford protections to religious freedom in private and public settings, but that freedom is also not absolute, especially when it comes back to restricting the rights of others. And I think that's sort of where we start to get into a grey area, especially when there's government funding involved, such as for schools and things like that. There's a nuance there that now this isn't purely in the purely religious realm. This is also a whole of government service, and I think we should consider that. As I said, I'm not going to compete with Andrew's summary of the things. I am going to say that by and by, generally, the Australian Greens will probably stand by anti-discrimination and rights of the individual before the church. Just to put it simply, I'd say that's a fair enough summary, and that's because we will always stand by treating that people have the right to equality, the right to dignity, to being treated with respect, and for not being judged for who they are or being made to feel like they should change who they are. So, in a nutshell.
Thank you, Janet. All right, the biggie, obviously, around our election campaign, cost of living. As a church, we run a food co-op, and the demand for that has grown exponentially over that time, and it's real. So let's watch the video and then we can talk about that.
For more than 160 years, Anglicare Sydney has been dedicated to serving our community, providing essential support to older Australians, families in crisis, and those struggling with housing and financial insecurity. As the housing crisis deepens and cost of living pressures intensify, financial hardship is affecting more people than ever. Parents are struggling to put food on the table, families are being forced from their homes due to rising rents, and those escaping domestic violence often have nowhere to turn as they start over. Hardship now touches a broad cross-section of society: working Australians, people on income support, retirees, pensioners, First Nations communities, and culturally and linguistically diverse families. For many, this is the first time they've ever needed help. With an election taking place in the midst of a cost of living crisis, we know that voters expect real solutions. So that's why we're asking every candidate a simple but critical question. If elected, what will you do to ease the cost of living pressures on individuals and families, especially those most at risk?
All right, Andrew.
As an independent, I, of course, can't promise an outcome. Parties can promise an outcome. I can promise to agitate for change, and the sorts of things I already agitate for and I'll continue to agitate for should I be re-elected. Where do I start? I'll start with government pensions and payments. Obviously unemployment benefits are way below the poverty line, but even age pension, the disability pension, the full carers payment, it's arguably below the poverty line and they should be lifted. The profiteering from supermarkets must be reined in. The ACCC a few weeks ago tabled its report into the supermarkets, and it found that Australian supermarkets are the most profitable in the world. At a time like this, that is unacceptable. You know, for a packet of crisps in 12 months to go from $3 to $6, that is inexplicable. There can be no other explanation except profiteering. So too with the insurance companies, they are profiteering. Australia's health insurance companies are really profitable and wealthy. But also insurance on property. You know, you hear on the radio stories about people's premiums going up for $20,000, North Queensland by $20,000 a year. But even around here, all of a sudden, insurance premiums go up by $1,000 or $2,000. They're not in a flood zone. There's not a bushfire overlay. You know, it just doesn't make sense. Rental controls. I'm attracted to what they have in the ACT, where rents are limited in how much they can be raised annually. Now, I know property investors don't like that, but, you know, renters don't like having to pay 3/4 of their age pension on their rent either. Better public education funding, so we can rein in this current practice of schools charging levies. Now, I've got two stepsons at Taroona High. Their levies each year, they're way over $500 a year. Now that's supposed to be free public education, and the levies are going to things like consumables for the photocopier and stuff. You know, running costs for the school. We need much better consumer protection. I think the ACCC, the Competition and Consumer Commission, should be given real teeth to go after people who profiteer and treat consumers badly and make life more dear than it needs to be. And I'd start with bank fees, and while on a roll, I'd probably go across to the airlines and you know, bring them to heel, because at the moment there are industry sectors and companies that are running roughshod over consumers, and of course, while we're talking about the cost of housing, we have to have a conversation about tax reform for investment properties. I think that needs to be reformed and reined in, perhaps grandfathered, so people who are in the retirement phase and have made decisions in good faith about having a couple of investment properties, they shouldn't be disadvantaged. But there needs to be change from this point in time.
Thank you, Andrew. So, Janet, where do you and the Australian Greens sit on that?
Here we go. I must say, it's been so awesome being in here and hearing about the food kitchen. And, you know, I owe such a such a debt to Anglicare because they took my homeless schizophrenic father in when I thought I was going to have to take him in, and they found him a home, and oh gosh, I cannot thank them enough. So my personal debt. But anyway, cost of living. We've got to attack this multi-pronged across the board. So Greens policies include covering health. So we want dental into Medicare. We want to have essentially everyone be able to see a GP for free by boosting bulk billing incentives. We want to address housing. There's several aspects to this. The Greens actually want to establish a government-owned property developer, like we did after World War II, to actually build affordable, sustainable homes and social housing. Like Andrew, we want to address tax handouts. We want to regulate the banks to control how much profit they can make on mortgages, limit the interest rate above the current limit their interest rates against the current rate, is what I'm trying to say. Also continue to look after renters' rights. You know, we've got 7 million people in this country are renters, so it's no small portion. We also want to attack education, so free childcare, free early education, free public education, get rid of those $500, what do they call, levies every year, and also bring back free university and TAFE, and also wiping student debt. We want to strengthen social services and do things like raise the income support payments so they're above the poverty line, which to me is a no-brainer, but apparently, in our current climate it is. We also want to do actions that also assist with climate change and preparing us for the impact. So things like having grants and low interest loans for installing solar and battery storage, and also energy efficiency upgrades to houses, both owned and rented. We want to attack public transport, so have 50-cent fees nationwide, which has worked in Queensland, and also do things like make supermarket price gouging illegal. Now, you could be sitting there going, whoa, go Greenies, you're just going to bankrupt us in 1 week, the way you're going. And we have an answer to that. So, in Australia, in the top 100 companies, one in 3 of our big top 100 corporations actually pay no tax. So your nurse, your high school teacher, your elected representative are all paying more tax than them. So the Greens have actually gone to the... what are they called? The public... begins with D and I've forgotten. Parliamentary Budget Office, thank you. And actually had a plan costed that's by doing things like putting a bit of a surcharge on our top billionaires and 40% tax on excess profits for companies that have over 100 million in turnover. We can actually raise over 500 billion. Now, imagine what we can do with that. That's just insane. It bugs me to some degree that institutions like Anglicare are carrying the load for this country, because I think government should be doing better. And as Andrew said, he can be an agitator, and small parties like the Greens can also be an agitator too. So the last time the Greens were in the balance of power, we got things like dental into Medicare for children. We want to get the balance of power again so we can cause more agitation and make Labor do better, or Liberal do better, if that's the case. But our main thing is we deserve better in a country this wealthy.
Thank you, Janet. Thanks for your passion in that. I'm enjoying hearing that. Thank you so much. All right, Andrew, we're into your zone, gambling, and obviously we're here in the northern suburbs, and we see it, and we see what it does to people. So let's look at the video and let's talk about what we could do about that.
Australia is in the middle of a gambling epidemic. The figures show Australians lose per capita more than any other country in the world, a staggering $31.5 billion. In this cost of living election, it's salient to know that families are losing more to gambling than they're spending on their utility bills. More than 2 years ago, the Murphy Parliamentary Inquiry delivered a report to the government recommending, amongst other things, a full ban on gambling advertising. It's a move that polls show 72% of Australians support. So, will you, as a candidate in this federal election, commit to support the implementation of all 31 recommendations of the Murphy Review? We believe it's incredibly important to protect our kids and to protect our community from gambling harm.
Andrew.
Yes, of course I support the hasty implementation of all 31 recommendations of the Peter Murphy report. And then I would go further. I would ban political donations from gambling companies to politicians and political parties. I would ban the political parties actually owning poker machine venues like the Labor Party does through clubs in Canberra and in Sydney. You know, you can count. You know my history on this. You can count on me to keep chipping away. I'll look for every opportunity to push for reform, and I'll tell you why I do it. Because this isn't just numbers and statistics. Every gambling addict is a mum or a dad or a brother or sister or a son or a daughter or a work colleague, a best friend. Every one of those gambling addicts is a human being. And typically those addicts lose their job, they lose relationships, they lose their family, they lose their house, they lose their health, they lose their life. The prevalence of suicide from gambling addiction is unknown. It is underreported. It's easily put at more than one suicide a day in this country from gambling addiction. We also know from the Tasmanian government's own research that for every gambling addict, between 5 and 10 people are affected. So this isn't about maybe 5,000 gambling addicts in Tasmania, it's about the 25 to 50,000 people who are affected by those gambling addicts in Tasmania. It's not just about the 100,000 gambling addicts in the country also, again it's underreported, it's about the 500,000 to 1 million people that are affected. It's a human story, and it beggars belief that the major political parties don't care about it, because that's the bottom line. If they cared about those people and those people affected, they would do everything in their power to make gambling safe. Now, I'm not anti-gambling, I'm pro-harm minimisation, and we know what measures will reduce the harm. We know that banning gambling advertising will encourage fewer people to gamble. It will mean fewer triggers for gambling addicts to be prompted to go and lay a bet when they're trying desperately to recover from their addiction, but they would like to watch the footy on a Saturday afternoon. We know that cashless poker machine play with a pre-commitment function will drastically reduce gambling addiction. And by the way, according to the New South Wales Crime Commission, it will drastically reduce black money in the economy and money laundering.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for fighting the good fight on that front. We appreciate, what you've done over the years and where you stand on that. So thank you so much, Janet.
And I want to say how wonderful it was to have actually be asked this question, because I'm horrified that it hasn't actually come up in any of this election campaign in any of my conversations, which is horrific when you just think about how rife gambling is as a problem for our society. So thank you very much to whoever pulled that one together. Yes. Definitely, the Greens definitely want to implement all of the recommendations of the Gambling Harm Inquiry. And also, we want to establish a national gambling regulator who can basically make sense of the current patchwork of regulations that we have in this space and oversee licensing, compliance and harm reduction efforts. And we also want to make sure they have effective powers, so they're not just a rubber stamp, but can actually have significant enforcement power and apply penalties. I don't know if you know, last year the Greens actually introduced in the Senate a banned gambling ads bill that wasn't passed, which it just blows my mind that we can't even do simple things like block ads an hour before the game or during the game or things like that, or during kids' viewing times. The Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young has said this gambling reform, it's the unfinished business of the Parliament, and I can tell you the Greens aren't going to stand by. And on a personal note, you know, I think it's definitely the unfinished business of this Parliament. We're going to push to get it done, because I have a feeling Andrew is not going to stand down until this is the Murphy Review implemented. So I have a vested interest here in let's get Andrew's life work done, completed, for the betterment of us all.
Thank you so much. Let's have a look at persecuted minorities now, and it's again one of those things that doesn't get a lot of press, and there's a video on that. But basically, the question is, how will you ensure persecuted religious minorities, those who cannot safely register with the UNHCR, receive fair consideration in Australia's humanitarian intake and resettlement program?
Greetings and best wishes to all the federal election candidates. I'm Jude Simeon, chairperson of HOMINA, the human rights organization for the Middle East and North Africa, and the executive director of Philoy Global. HOMINA is a network formed by the Heads of Churches Conference under the initiative Dealing with Diversity. Since 2012, we have been at the forefront of assisting persecuted religious minorities from regions such as Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Sudan, Eritrea, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and many more. This is our question as a collective Christian community in Australia. Australia has been a champion of human rights and religious freedom, but right now our immigration system is failing some of the most vulnerable persecuted religious minorities. Christian converts, the Ahmadiyya community, and others fleeing persecution often cannot register with UNHCR or disclose their faith in their host countries. Why? Because doing so could put them in even greater danger. Yet, Australia's humanitarian intake still relies and prioritizes UNHCR referrals, leaving these people with no clear pathway to safety. The current refugee policy does not even mention religious minorities. So my question is this: how will you ensure that persecuted religious minorities, those who cannot safely register with UNHCR, receive fair consideration in the Australia's humanitarian intake and resettlement program?
So Janet.
I'll start, yeah. The Greens believe that everyone deserves fairness, compassion, and the opportunity to thrive and live, regardless of their country of origin or their religion or any other personal characteristic. And I must admit, sometimes, I hate to bag them when they're not here to defend themselves, but sometimes watching Labor and Liberal, it just seems they're in a race to the bottom and determined to inflict deliberate cruelty on people just in need, which really grates me no end. So the Greens have a plan to sort of essentially rebuild our immigration system to ensure that we welcome refugees with dignity, we support families with fairness, and we foster social inclusion. So there's three main aspects to this: that we want to expand Australia's humanitarian intake to 50,000 places per year, so providing safety and a new start for those fleeing persecution. We also want to establish a new urgent humanitarian response visa category, so to allow us to respond fairly and quickly to any urgent humanitarian crisis that's happening. And we also want to create additional places via a new private humanitarian sponsorship program. I guess there's other elements to this too, in that we also want to address how people are treated while they are seeking their new life and fleeing harm. So we want to end offshore detention and bring all of the people still in Papua New Guinea or Nauru to Australia. We do not support mandatory detention and argue that only if we do have extreme cases, that detention must be for something like 7 days, not the average 2 years that we have now. And we also want to launch a royal commission into Australia's immigration detention regime. And I don't think it ends there. I actually think it's we need to provide support to people once they are here in Australia. So unfortunately, racism, in my mind, really comes into discussions on immigration. The Greens have been pushing for years for the new National Anti-Racism Framework, which finally came into effect last year. And now we're pushing for full funding for the Australian Human Rights Commissioner to implement the framework. And so that framework covers all these good things like First Nations, legal reform, police and justice, education, health and workplaces. So there's so much in there. So that's our stance.
Do you think that would address the issue of religious minorities being able to have the safety to register with the UNHCR?
I think so. I mean, we don't make any distinction between what you're being persecuted for. If you're not safe, then you should be eligible to come and find safety here.
Yeah, okay. Andrew?
Yeah, it's a really good question. An element of the question is how do we do it outside of the UNHCR framework?
Yeah.
And look, governments can do whatever they want when they put their mind to it. I mean, they're the government. For example, to get people quickly out of Ukraine, they issued tourist visas, I think it was. To get people quickly out of Afghanistan after the fall of Kabul, that seemed to be done in large part unilaterally by the Australian government. That didn't seem to come through the UNHCR channel. When quite a large number of Christians were evacuated from Syria to Australia, that seemed to be, it was either through the UNHCR and somehow fast-tracked, or it was outside the UNHCR. So my point is there are ways to do this if you want to do it. And from time to time, we have wanted to do it. And there's a few examples there now. I wish the government would want to do it now, particularly going back to Syria. Now that there's been a change of regime in Damascus, the Christian minority in Syria are being persecuted, something terrible.
Absolutely.
The Alawat, who are that's a branch of Islam, I think, Alawat, because Assad was Alawat, so Assad's gone, so the Alawat are copping a terrible time. Yes, when there are religious minorities, not just Christians, but any sort of religious minority, we should pull out all stops to help them. And coming back to my point about what a rich country we are so lucky. Surely one of our priorities should be an expanded humanitarian intake. We can afford, and we have the space to accommodate many more people through the humanitarian intake. If someone is genuinely fleeing persecution, we should give them protection. We should then give them refuge. There's no good reason not to. I mean, these people who are knocking on our door in big long queues through the UNHCR system, they're engineers, they're doctors, they're plumbers, they're sparkies, they're psychologists, they're nurses, they're social workers, they're entrepreneurs. They're the sort of people we need. I remember reading a book, The Rug Maker of Mazar-e-Sharif. He was a Hazara who was in the Woomera detention centre during the Howard years. And in one of the chapters, he reflects on how, looking around the yard, he saw every skill and trade to make a country from scratch. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk a lot about that, couldn't we? Like our immigration system as to, there's need and then there's function. And yeah, I'll hold myself back from delving in, but yeah. We've also got the opportunity of online things to come in. I don't think we've got anything there. We are a small group, so if anybody has a question, and we're happy to take that from the floor, obviously. Do it respectfully, and I think that's part of who we are as faith people. We believe everybody's created in the image of God and deserves dignity. So it's important that we respond that way, and I'm sure that will be the case. But any questions from the floor tonight? Eric, yeah. Can we just get Eric a mic for the sake of online. Yeah, just so they can hear it online.
Look, it's a beautiful evening. Thank you for coming out. This is a church, so I'm just going to start the batting with the blindingly obvious question. Who is Jesus?
Who is Jesus? The Son of God.
I'm not sure what else I'm meant to ask to that. Yeah, go back to my Son of God put on earth. Are you asking, do I believe in... I don't personally follow the faith that I was raised in, but I still use Jesus as a role model in how I should behave, if that makes sense. So I'm not a religious person, but I am a spiritual person.
Yeah, can I just respond? I'm not actually comfortable with, if the question is, what do I believe in? You know, am I a person of faith? And if so, what is the shape of it? I think that's an intensely personal matter. I can understand why you would want to know what I believe in, but I'd rather you judge me by my behaviour, what I fight for, what I try and achieve. I think unless someone is offering it to you to talk about their family life or their belief system, I think it's a private matter.
I respectfully disagree. And Jesus, the Bible, and what we colloquially term Judeo-Christianity is the moral, spiritual and social foundation of Western civilization. So it can't be a personal faith only. Therefore, if you are a person in public life, what you believe about Jesus or who Jesus was or wasn't, in your opinion, matters.
Okay, no, and I respect your point of view, but just as I wouldn't answer questions about my family tonight, I'm not going to answer questions about my beliefs. I think people know enough about me, they can judge my values.
I will say, Eric, I would love if someone here tonight actually went away and, in the car home said, I feel like God's using Janet to do something good. And I'd probably disagree with you on that mechanism, but I certainly wouldn't object to it. And if that makes sense, the idea of someone thinking that I'm doing God's work would be wonderful.
I tell you what I do disagree with. It quite offends me is when politicians use religion and faith as a political tool. They all of a sudden start stumping up to Mass on a Sunday morning, or you know what I'm getting at. Or even if they are people of a strong faith, the way some of my colleagues might try and market that, I find that pretty unpleasant.
Yeah, and I think actually people of faith and from the church are just as happy to know where somebody stands on those things, even if they don't agree. So yeah, I respect what you had to say there, Andrew, and thanks for your question too, Eric. Yeah, it's a bold question. Yeah. So thank you. Any others here tonight?
So I was wondering, you've both mentioned the housing crisis and how you want tax reform to kind of deal with it, and you've both mentioned gambling reform. These are both things that neither the Labor Party or the Liberal Party are addressing at the moment. Why do you think they're unable to meet the moment for those issues and others?
On gambling reform and...
housing and tax reform to do with housing.
And the what?
Tax reform to do with housing. So, yeah.
Oh, why are they not tackling the big issues? That's a very good question. I think both major parties are they're weak. I don't think they're prepared to tackle the big issues. I mean, I found this election campaign really underwhelming and disheartening. Where is the discussion about tax reform? You know, do we need to, or don't we need to raise the GST? You know, do we need root and branch reform of tax reform? Where's the discussion about Australia's place in the world at the moment? Which you know, there should be an international dimension to our debate at the moment. Where's the discussion about our relationship with the United States under this presidency? You know, when it comes to, say, housing, okay, as a case study, both major parties have come out with some interesting reforms, most of which have been loudly criticised by economists. But where's the big discussion about housing reform? Everything from more crisis accommodation to transitional accommodation to supported accommodation to public and affordable housing to protection for renters to tax reform for investors. Where's the big discussion and debate about that? One of the problems is the political class, we've got no capital in the bank anymore because we are held in such low regard by so many Australians because we've let them down for so long. And we now have this culture where the opposition just opposes. It doesn't matter what the merit of an idea is, the opposition, whoever it is when they're opposition, just think their job is to tear down and destroy. You know, that's the country we're living in at the moment. And it's sad because, as I've said twice, we're one of the richest countries in the world. We're probably the richest people on the planet. No other country in the world has the natural advantages or has more human capital or nous than us. But I just feel the country's drifting.
Where are 3 other candidates?
Yeah.
That's a very good point, actually.
True.
Yeah, completely agree with you, Andrew, and I guess this inaction in this space from the 2 major parties, I can only sort of assume that it's due to the vested interests of from whom they receive political donations. This is a bit of a rant of mine because being a public servant, we take conflict of interests very seriously. I have to declare anything that I'm involved in, and it really bugs me that that isn't happening with our political masters, essentially, that they're not bound to actually disclose how much they're receiving from property investors, how much they're receiving from banks and mining companies and things like that that are taking our natural resources. So I'd argue we need better transparency in this country.
Thanks, Janet. We've got time for one more, or we have one.
Well, I came with about 8 questions, so I've got to pick which one to ask. I had 20 years in the public service in consumer affairs, set up the Rental Bond Board and got the elder abuse strategy across the line. So a little bit of history there. I lost my career because I refused the jab. So I'm curious about your views on medical freedom and specifically on the pandemic treaty.
Well, my Bill of Rights that I referred to, that I moved a couple of times, that included to a personal freedom of choice when it comes to medical care, which could be taken to mean, it wasn't the intention, it could be taken to mean that someone has a right not to be vaccinated. However, elsewhere in my bill, I made it explicit that no one had a right to do something or make a choice and do something if it would be harmful to anyone else. So that's, if that was the bit of the bill that effectively fell in behind the way the pandemic was handled. So if I could decode that, I'm not a medical doctor. I, through the pandemic, put my trust in medical professionals, and I still do, and my wife is one. But I think it would be very healthy for the country to be doing a much more effective investigation of that period, with terms of reference to look at every aspect of it and to see where we could have done better, where we did badly, and where we did well. Did that answer the question?
Do you think I should have lost my job for refusing the jab or suffered any other form of sanction up to and including imprisonment and removal of my children and exclusion from venues?
Okay, I can't possibly answer that question when I don't know all the details. No, I can't. I can't possibly. I don't know exactly what job you had, all of the details, and this isn't the place to canvass it. I'd be very happy for us to meet face to face over a cup of tea and actually go through all those details. Okay, but I'm not well enough informed now to answer a question as important as that.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough, Andrew. Thank you, Eric, for asking that. Anything to add there, Janet?
Oh, yeah, big one, and that's... I don't claim to have an answer on this. I just know, I mean, for my job in the public service, when I was working for the Bureau of Meteorology, travelling around, we had to get vaccinations as part of our job. It's part and parcel. Certainly we had to get extra vaccinations when I was going to work in the Aboriginal community of Warracoona, and simply because we know that our First Nations people are so much more volatile, susceptible to short lifespans, and so it was a part of my job that I accepted that I had to have vaccinations. Yeah, but I really hate the witch hunt, is how I see it, that happened during COVID, and certainly it sounds like you really suffered the brunt of it for making a moral stand, but I don't, like Andrew, I don't necessarily back you up in that space, unfortunately, without hearing full details. I guess when I look back on COVID, what the bigger outrage I have, and I'm sorry, I'm sort of pivoting away from your question here, but the outrage I have is that how it was handled at a national level. That I was in Melbourne at the time, and we were still having people arriving, international flights, and we weren't putting them out in regional a nice regional camp or something like that, in cabins in the middle of nowhere. We were putting them in capital cities, and that to me was just complete incompetence when when the failure rate for containing COVID in these hotels was so rampant. So that's probably where my rage sits, in that we should have done better handling it that way, and then we wouldn't necessarily have gone to the extent that you had. But that isn't answering your question, Eric. I completely acknowledge that, but I'm going to avoid it too, like Andrew. So.
Yeah. Thank you, and obviously that's something. Andrew has given the invitation to talk about that, and I think that's generous. So thank you for doing that, and obviously another big can of worms that we look at in hindsight, but I guess it highlights the whole personal liberty thing that is huge. Well, I said to Andrew that we'd try and finish by 8:30. I think we're going to do it. Before you go, one of the things that we're encouraged to do as followers of Jesus or Christian people is to pray for our politicians, whether they're on our political side or not, or whether we agree with them or not. But and I think Jesus actually answered that question very well when people tried to draw him down an alley into something, around taxes, and he held out a coin and said to them, well, whose head's on that? And they all said Caesar. And the famous saying is, give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's. In other words, understanding that governments are in place, and it's our responsibility to actually pray for them, and to serve them where we can, unless that is a complete violation of our faith. So I want to pray for you in that respectful way, and particularly even hearing your own journey, Janet, in that. I thank you for sharing that, and just to know that as a faith communities and churches in Hobart, we do regularly pray for our politicians, and we want the best for you. And I want to thank you for Janet, for, deciding to stand and actually stand up for what you believe and serve our community in that. And obviously you've done that in your other life. And I thank you, Andrew, for your years of service and at times standing up for things that haven't been popular and delving into those spaces. So thank you so much. So let's pray for Andrew and Janet as we finish tonight. Father, we just thank you for this great nation of Australia. We thank you that we are incredibly blessed. And as this election comes up, and sometimes we do feel a little underwhelmed by what's being talked about, but we thank you for those people that choose to stand, those people that want to represent us as people, and we just ask that you would strengthen them, that you would help them in the job that they have. And we pray for our nation. We pray that as a result of this election, regardless of what we see now, that we would actually see our nation go forward. We would be a nation that is known in the future for our hospitality to others, to those things that actually have made us great. We thank you for Andrew. We thank you for Janet. And we ask that you would bless them as they go through this campaign and into the future. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you so much.
8:30 on the dot.
Good job. I don't do that well.